An enigmatic death and a series of spiritual revelations allegedly linked to extreme artistic practices have significantly shaken international public opinion. The death of Chinese actor Yu Menglong, known for his television and film career, has not only left a void in the cultural sphere, but has also raised a series of questions about the circumstances surrounding his final days. Various statements, including those of an American medium named Cadista, have added an additional layer of complexity to the public debate. What invisible forces, social dynamics, and institutional structures might be linked to this case that has captured global attention? But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms are really driving this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial missteps to the irreversible damage, to observe how the entertainment industry operates and how a public figure is redefined in an environment where the boundaries between art, power, and silence seem to blur. This approach aims to offer an analytical, objective perspective, free of value judgments, in order to contextualize the available information and shed light on the complexity of the case. Media attention began to intensify when, on November 1st, the American medium Cadista published audiovisual content in which she claimed to have established a spiritual contact with the deceased actor. Her testimony, shared with over 160,000 followers, described scenes and elements that, according to her account, matched information previously mentioned in some Chinese forums. The coincidence of descriptions contributed to the video's widespread dissemination, sparking speculation, debates, and unanswered questions. Although there are no official verifications to support such claims, the media impact was evident. In particular, Cadista claimed to have perceived images associated with an alleged physical and psychological confinement, as well as references to practices she interpreted as rituals or extreme artistic displays. She also indicated that, according to her vision, multiple individuals had participated in or remained silent about what happened. The medium claimed that the message she supposedly received indicated that Yu Menglong's death would have implications for other entertainment professionals, suggesting an environment where certain behaviors were part of internal dynamics. Again, these are media claims without institutional confirmation, but their dissemination generated considerable interest and controversy. At the same time, the case became more complex due to the connection some members of the public drew between the medium's statements and Beijing's 798 Art District, a contemporary cultural space known for experimental exhibitions. Social media posts reported temporary access restrictions to the site, which fueled public speculation. Although there were no official statements linking the district to the actor's death, the temporal coincidence between rumors and specific cultural events fueled questions in the digital debate. To understand the magnitude of the case's media impact, it is necessary to examine the initial context in which the accounts associated with Yu Menglong's death emerged. The actor, active in the Chinese entertainment industry, was primarily known for television productions and for portraying characters with a high degree of dramatic complexity. His public profile was firmly established, meaning that any event involving him would automatically draw collective attention. However, what set this case apart from other incidents involving public figures was the unusual combination of spiritual, artistic, institutional, and social elements. The first piece of the media puzzle was put in place by the testimony of the medium Cadista. Her statement suggested that she had witnessed symbolic scenes that, according to her interpretation, corresponded to events surrounding the actor's death. These scenes included descriptions of a space resembling an old, supposedly dilapidated hotel, where there were elements the medium described as disturbing: ropes, anatomical representations, and abandoned furniture. From an analytical standpoint, these images are part of a personal narrative without documentary support, but they served as a catalyst for global interest because they partly coincided with rumors previously circulated on digital forums in China. Cadista's narrative structure also mentioned the existence of a large group that, according to her, was aware of the events and had chosen not to intervene or speak out publicly. This component, the idea of a collective silence, contributed to the narrative taking on a broader dimension, as it suggested social dynamics in which hierarchies and fear of consequences could play a significant role. Again, from an objective standpoint, such claims have not been confirmed by official sources, but the dissemination of these concepts generated an interpretive framework that fueled public discussion. The isolated mention of the 798 Art Zone added an additional layer to the debate. The district, originally linked to the state defense industry before its transformation into a contemporary art center, is characterized by experimental exhibitions that seek to challenge the boundaries between art and social perception. The physical structure of the site, reformed factories, expansive spaces, conceptual interventions, often generates diverse interpretations among domestic and international visitors. Within the digital narrative, some users associated the content shared by Cadista with extreme artistic activities or conceptual installations that had been misinterpreted or extrapolated. There were mentions of recent exhibitions in the district, including one based on the processes of capturing, raising, and sacrificing fish, which drew attention due to its symbolic nature. In the context of the case, some internet users drew a connection between the surname Vu and a Chinese term that evokes the word fish, leading to interpretations based on phonetic wordplay rather than verifiable links. This demonstrates how linguistic phenomena can generate extrapolations in a highly sensitive public debate environment. The analysis of the case must also consider the speed at which this information spread. In the contemporary digital ecosystem, fragmented narratives can be amplified in a short amount of time, especially when they combine elements of mystery, public figures, and symbolic references. In this scenario, the absence of detailed official statements acted as an information vacuum that facilitated the emergence of multiple interpretations. The dissemination of the medium Cadista's testimony, coupled with the absence of detailed official information about the specific circumstances of Wu Menglong's death, created a scenario in which collective speculation was significantly amplified. Within hours, multiple digital platforms began reproducing fragments of the original video, accompanied by independent interpretations, alternative theories, and discussions among users seeking to identify possible links between the elements described by the medium and recent events in the Chinese art scene. This phenomenon is a representative case of how contemporary public opinion reacts to narratives imbued with symbolism and mystery. Social media played a decisive role in this process. The circulation of information through short-form content platforms made it easier for incomplete or decontextualized messages to reach a wide range of audiences in different countries. Recommendation algorithms, by prioritizing massive interactions, allowed the topic to escalate rapidly, regardless of the veracity or coherence of the accounts. Various online comments pointed out that the temporal coincidence between the actor's death and the promotion of certain art exhibitions in Zone 798 heightened the perception that there was a direct relationship between the two, even though no confirmed data supported such a connection. Public interest was also influenced by another factor: Wu Menglong's professional career. As an actor with widespread recognition and a presence in numerous television productions, his image had an emotional impact on a significant segment of viewers. According to digital behavior analysis, audiences tend to react more intensely when a case involves public figures whose cultural works they regularly consume. This symbolic identification causes social media conversations to intensify and persist for extended periods. The media frenzy led to the emergence of two main lines of interpretation within public discourse. The first group comprised users who considered Cadista's statements to be a revealing testimony, arguing that her description matched previous rumors on Chinese digital platforms. For this group, the similarities between the accounts fueled the possibility that there was a broader underlying story that had not yet been exposed by official sources. This perception was reinforced by the fact that the medium claimed to have no prior knowledge of the actor's professional identity, which some internet users interpreted as an indication of subjective authenticity. The second line of interpretation was composed of individuals who questioned the validity of the disseminated accounts. This group emphasized the lack of verifiable evidence, the subjective nature of spiritual practices, and the risk that speculation could contribute to the circulation of uncorroborated information. In this context, it was observed that a segment of the audience was calling for a more cautious, data-driven approach. For these users, the parallels between the medium's accounts and the digital rumors did not constitute conclusive evidence, but rather coincidences likely to arise in an environment of high media exposure. The analysis of these two currents reveals how the fragmentation of information in digital environments stimulates the construction of parallel narratives. Each audience segment selects the elements it considers relevant and omits those it perceives as inconsistent. The result is a discursive ecosystem where multiple narratives coexist simultaneously without a central mechanism to unify or verify the distributed data. One of the most visible effects of the media frenzy was the concentration of attention on the 728 art zone. Although the authorities did not announce any connection between the district and the actor's death, the public debate increased the perception that the area might harbor extreme creative dynamics or installations that some users associated with the Cadista narrative. Online comments indicated that, as of November 2nd, some visitors reported temporary nighttime access restrictions to the area. Although these observations were widely circulated, they were not accompanied by any official statements formally explaining the circumstances or the rationale behind the restrictions. This information gap reinforced the speculative narrative. The digital community began to investigate the district's history, highlighting its origins as part of a defense industrial complex and its subsequent transformation into a contemporary art center. The presence of experimental exhibitions, including works that used biological elements or conceptual representations of vital processes, was interpreted by some users as a context compatible with the elements described by Cadista. Even so, the lack of specific documentation directly linking these events to the actor's case kept the discussion on a hypothetical level. Likewise, speculation intensified when some internet users drew attention to the phonetic similarity between the surname Vu and a Chinese term related to the word fish. This linguistic association coincided with a recent exhibition in the area based on the life cycle of fish. Although from an analytical perspective, this connection does not constitute verifiable evidence, it did serve as a narrative reinforcement mechanism for certain discussion groups. This phenomenon illustrates how cultural and linguistic patterns can influence public interpretation when there is an information vacuum and a high demand for explanations. As the case gained visibility, some public discussions began to incorporate themes related to the historical background of the cultural and medical industries in China. Users mentioned previous reports about the use of human specimens in international anatomical exhibitions, particularly those associated with plastination programs developed in cities such as Dalian. References were also made to allegations by human rights organizations of coercive organ harvesting in past decades. Although these issues have no confirmed connection to Wu Menglong's death, their inclusion in the public discussion reflects a tendency to broaden the interpretive framework when a case lacks official conclusions. The presence of these references in the digital debate highlights a common pattern in media crises. When an incident involves symbolism, celebrities, and a considerable degree of uncertainty, public opinion tends to connect the case to historical issues that carry significant emotional or ethical weight. This process does not necessarily imply that there is a factual relationship between the phenomena mentioned, but rather reveals a socio-psychological mechanism in which individuals seek narrative coherence in the absence of concrete data. From a strictly analytical perspective, this phenomenon suggests that the public discussion surrounding Wu Menglong's death shifted, at least in part, from the individual level to a structural one, in which historical dynamics, institutional practices, and artistic contexts were examined. This demonstrates that a lack of clear information can cause a specific case to become a reference point for broader debates about institutional trust, transparency, and safety in the entertainment industry. In crisis management analysis, one of the fundamental elements is examining how institutions, public figures, or related entities react to the mass circulation of unverified information. In the case of Wu Menglong's death, the absence of comprehensive statements in the early stages created an information vacuum that allowed alternative narratives to gain greater prominence in the public discourse. This phenomenon is recurrent in situations where an event involves high-profile figures and triggers an immediate demand for explanations. From a crisis communication perspective, prolonged silence can be interpreted in two different ways depending on public perception: as institutional prudence or as a lack of transparency. The absence of official clarifications regarding the specific circumstances of the actor's death allowed various segments of the public to form interpretations based on fragments and subjective perceptions. The spread of hypotheses on social media, some influenced by statements from the medium Cadista, created an atmosphere in which the public expected a clear, structured response from relevant authorities. In this context, it is important to distinguish between the function of an official statement, whose purpose is to provide clarity and public reassurance, and the dynamics of digital environments, which tend to fill any void with speculative or interpretive content. The lack of a concrete communication strategy favored the spread of symbolic narratives and rumors that, although unverified, gained significant traction in discussion forums. Although no detailed statements directly linked to the speculations were published, it was observed that the general information available remained at a minimum, limited to confirming the death without including any additional details. This approach, common in situations where an internal investigation is underway, did not prevent the public from interpreting the lack of information as a matter of interest. In this case, communication management was characterized by caution and a lack of public interventions to counter emerging narratives. Within the analytical framework, it is relevant to note that the spread of rumors was not accompanied by explicit attempts to debunk them through formal statements. This decision, whether intentional or the result of internal processes, contributed to keeping speculative discourses active that linked the case to extreme artistic practices, clandestine activities, or the symbolic environments of the 798 art district. The lack of an institutional stance left the discussion in the hands of the digital sphere, where information circulates rapidly and without verification mechanisms. Crisis communication strategies typically include measures such as official clarifications, press conferences, the publication of verified timelines, and coordination with the media to counter misinformation. In this case, the lack of such communicative structures hindered the consolidation of a verifiable narrative framework. Instead of reducing speculation, the lack of intervention indirectly contributed to symbolic elements, such as the Cadista narrative or references to the industrial past of Zone 798, taking center stage in the public debate. Cadista's statements formed a central pillar of the public interpretation. Although there was no material evidence to validate her testimony, the medium provided descriptions that partially matched previous rumors on social media. From a crisis management perspective, these types of narratives can have a considerable impact, as they combine symbolic, emotional, and visual elements that facilitate their dissemination. A significant challenge for any entity responsible for managing a crisis of this magnitude is deciding whether or not to address unverified statements. By choosing not to publicly refute Cadista's accounts, the institutions allowed them to become firmly embedded in the digital ecosystem. The lack of strategic intervention meant that the spiritual narrative not only persisted, but also became a recurring reference to explain the absence of concrete data. In crisis analysis, this phenomenon is known as a narrative containment vacuum. When no entity produces verifiable content that establishes clear boundaries, alternative narratives automatically fill that space. This is especially evident when the alternative content contains detailed descriptions or symbolic elements that the public perceives as consistent with prior rumors, even if there is no institutional confirmation. In this case, the description of an environment resembling an old hotel, the presence of objects interpreted as instruments of confinement, and the idea of a large group of people involved were aspects that resonated with certain segments of the audience, strengthening the alternative narrative. The approach adopted by the entities involved in the case resembled a no-intervention strategy, consisting of avoiding public comments to prevent unverified narratives from continuing to escalate in the media. However, from a technical standpoint, this type of strategy is effective only in contexts where the level of speculation is low and official information is released at an early stage. In situations where the demand for information is high, non-intervention can have the opposite effect, generating greater uncertainty and allowing unverified interpretations to gain traction. The strategy of silence also had repercussions on international perception, especially because the symbolic elements discussed encompassed sensitive topics such as artistic structures, the industrial background of the 798 district, and historical references to controversial medical practices. The combination of these elements created a scenario in which the international audience interpreted the silence as a sign that there were undisclosed aspects. From an analytical perspective, this reaction is consistent with sociological patterns that emerge when an event involves public figures and there is no systematic effort to clarify the facts. It is important to mention that a non-intervention strategy does not necessarily imply a lack of internal coordination. It may be linked to standard protocols that limit the release of information during specific periods. However, the public perception does not typically distinguish between institutional procedures and a lack of transparency. In this case, the lack of communication became a factor that fueled the spread of alternative theories. The analysis of the interaction between rumorology and communication management reveals that the lack of an official stance allowed various discursive currents to operate simultaneously without restriction. Rumors mingled with user analyses, symbolic reinterpretations, phonetic associations, and historical references disconnected from one another. This combination produced an ecosystem in which the public had to construct meaning from scattered fragments. The absence of an official framework caused these fragments to function as elements reinforcing unverified narratives. In terms of crisis management, this scenario demonstrates the importance of providing clear lines of interpretation from the outset. Even when there isn't complete information to disclose, preliminary statements can establish parameters that frame the discussion and reduce speculation. In contrast, the absence of these parameters allows speculation to become the primary source of perceived information. As the public discussion progressed, the case of Yu Menglong ceased to be understood solely as an isolated incident and began to be interpreted as an indicator of broader dynamics within the entertainment industry and the Chinese cultural ecosystem. The lack of clear, verifiable information about the circumstances of the death had a prolonged effect on the public's perception of the safety, well-being, and transparency surrounding public figures. This type of impact is common in situations where a personal event takes on significant media and social dimensions. Over time, the case contributed to greater public awareness of issues related to workplace pressure, media exposure, and the power structures operating within the industry. Although no official reports were published linking these factors to the actor's death, the debate that arose around them had an effect on the industry's overall image. Collective perception gradually shifted toward a more cautious stance, with audiences beginning to question what kinds of protection mechanisms exist for artists and to what extent institutions support their well-being. This type of prolonged repercussion has consequences for the industry as a whole, since it influences public trust, the evaluation of professional ethics, and the way future events are communicated. When a case becomes a reference point in sociocultural discussions, it typically sets a precedent that affects both creators and consumers, altering the dynamics of expectations and public scrutiny of internal processes. One of the most visible indirect effects was related to the 798 art zone. Although no official connection was established between the district and the actor's death, public speculation generated a notable level of scrutiny over the types of exhibitions, artistic activities, and entities involved in managing the space. The way the public interpreted the temporal coincidences between rumors, nighttime access restrictions, and conceptual exhibitions generated social questioning that, while not based on verifiable data, did impact the district's external perception. For cultural institutions, this type of speculative association can have lasting effects, especially when it involves sensitive topics or artistic practices that are misinterpreted in the digital environment. Contemporary art, in particular, is susceptible to being reinterpreted in contexts of uncertainty, since it frequently incorporates symbolic elements that can be disconnected from their original intent. The aforementioned exhibition on the life cycle of fish, for example, was presented as a conceptual piece, but was subsequently interpreted by some viewers as a symbolic element related to the actor's case due to a linguistic coincidence. The analysis of this reaction shows how public perception can influence the reputation of a cultural venue, even without direct evidence to justify such influence. For cultural management, this poses challenges in communication, transparency, and content contextualization, particularly in environments where information circulates instantly and in a decentralized manner. The expansion of the case into discussions about historical practices, including references to the plastination of human bodies in Dalian, international anatomical projects, and prior accusations of coercive organ harvesting, created a broader, interpretive framework that continues to influence the public conversation. Although these issues are not directly related to Wu Menglong's death, their inclusion in the debate suggests that there are unresolved collective memories that resurface when a high-profile case lacks official clarification. The persistence of these issues in public discourse is relevant to assessing the long-term impact. When the public associates a recent case with controversial historical events, the resulting narrative acquires additional layers that can perpetuate negative perceptions or institutional doubts over extended periods. This phenomenon demonstrates that, in the absence of clear information, public opinion tends to integrate prior knowledge, whether verifiable or not, into its analysis of the present. From an analytical standpoint, this trend can be interpreted as a manifestation of the social desire to impose narrative coherence in the face of uncertainty. This behavior, documented in sociological studies on crises and rumor mongering, suggests that when an event generates significant doubts, audiences turn to historical references that already carry symbolic weight to fill the perceived gaps. Although Wu Menglong could no longer participate in any public image reconstruction process of his own, subsequent discussions about his career and the interpretation of his public persona played an important role in gradually stabilizing the debate. In situations where a public figure dies under circumstances that generate speculation, the process of image reconstruction falls to secondary actors, colleagues, representatives, cultural institutions, fan communities, and the media. This process manifested itself in multiple dimensions. On the one hand, certain groups of fans began to highlight positive aspects of the actor's career, emphasizing his professionalism, his contribution to audiovisual culture, and the emotional impact of his best-known roles. These actions served as a way to preserve his legacy in the face of the proliferation of speculative narratives. On the other hand, some segments of the public adopted a more analytical approach, demanding institutional clarity and a verifiable interpretive framework that would allow for a better understanding of the circumstances. Although no detailed reports were issued, the public's interest in separating verifiable facts from unconfirmed accounts is an important element in reconstructing an image based on data rather than external interpretations. The concept of image reconstruction in post-crisis contexts refers not to altering the facts, but to reorganizing public perception by clarifying verifiable elements, presenting a coherent legacy, and progressively reducing the impact of unverified narratives. In this case, the process unfolded in a decentralized manner, without an explicit official strategy. The case also left several relevant lessons for the entertainment industry and crisis management in general. First, it demonstrated that the absence of verifiable information can create scenarios in which speculation becomes the dominant narrative for extended periods. Secondly, it demonstrated that social media platforms function as amplifiers of symbolic content, capable of intertwining personal stories with historical, artistic, or institutional themes, without any moderation mechanisms. At the structural level, one of the most relevant lessons is the importance of establishing clear lines of public communication even in the early stages of an event. Communicating what is known, what is not known, and the procedures underway can reduce uncertainty and mitigate speculation. Furthermore, the case underscores the need to understand how international perception can influence the reputation of cultural institutions, especially when they are indirectly linked to emerging narratives. More broadly, the case suggests that contemporary cultural and media environments require adaptive communication strategies that include active network monitoring, contextualized responses, and progressive clarification mechanisms. This is crucial to prevent symbolic narratives, even if unverified, from becoming dominant interpretive frameworks. Upon reviewing the set of dynamics surrounding Wu Menglong's death and the narratives that emerged around this event, a characteristic pattern of media crises in contemporary digital environments becomes apparent. The absence of verifiable information from the earliest stages created a void that was quickly filled by alternative interpretations, symbolic discourses, and associations with cultural and historical elements that extended beyond the initial case. The statements of the medium codista acted as a catalyst for interest due to their descriptive nature and partial alignment with prior rumors, allowing certain segments of the public to construct an interpretive framework with a high degree of speculation. In terms of crisis management, the case highlighted the fragility of strategies based on non-intervention in communication. When a high-profile public figure becomes involved in uncertain circumstances, the social demand for clarity and transparency increases substantially. The lack of detailed official statements allowed external narratives to take hold, which subsequently made it difficult to define the scope of the public discussion. This phenomenon not only influenced the perception of the actor as a public figure, but also the reputation of cultural spaces such as the 798 Art Zone and of institutions indirectly associated with historical rumors. Thus, the case became a point of reference for debates on institutional transparency, artist well-being, the boundaries of contemporary art, and protection mechanisms within the entertainment industry. Although no documentary evidence was obtained to confirm the interpretations circulating on social media, the persistence of these narratives demonstrates that public perception does not depend exclusively on verifiable facts, but also on how information, or the lack thereof, circulates within the digital ecosystem. From a structural point of view, this case offers several lessons applicable to communication and cultural management contexts. First, the importance of having early communication mechanisms in place to reduce uncertainty, even when available data are limited. Explaining procedures, timelines, and responsibilities can significantly help prevent the spread of speculation. Secondly, the case highlights the need for cultural institutions to adequately contextualize their activities and content so that external perceptions do not distort the original meaning of their works or initiatives. Third, the analysis demonstrates that social media operate as a decentralized system, capable of amplifying sensitive topics with great speed. Therefore, active monitoring and the creation of verifiable content are fundamental tools for balancing public discourse. Looking at the entire trajectory, it is clear that this crisis was dominated by a narrative built on symbolic fragments, external interpretations, and a communication vacuum that allowed multiple discourses to be perceived as possible explanations. Even though the case did not offer a detailed public resolution, it did provide a framework for reflection on how perceptions are shaped in today's media environment and what challenges public figures and institutions face when managing events of high emotional and social complexity.